Welcome to Perspectives with Barry Shainbaum. After 12 good years on Faith FM, we have moved on and we're now being produced in my studio in downtown Toronto. A big thank you to the good folks at Faith FM. My guest today is Ted Walter, the Director of Strategy for Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth. Ted lives in northern New York State and he joins us here in Toronto.
Thank you, Barry.
Ted Walter, how did you get involved with 911 issues in the first place?
Well, I started researching it seriously spring of 2006. Prior to that, I did have some questions. I remember on the day of 9/11 being kind of puzzled and stunned that buildings could just come down like that.
Did you see them come down with your own eyes?
I didn't see with my own eyes. It was my first day of classes as a college student in New York City, and I walked out of the building that I was in at the end of class, and the towers had just come down, and one whole side of the sky was covered in dust and smoke, with thousands of people pouring up the street. So 9/11 was sort of a part of my formative years and my introduction to New York City, and so it really colored my whole experience of living in the city as a college student. And I had doubts about it. As I said, it always kind of puzzled me that that's what it would look like when buildings collapsed. Yeah. But in 2006, I just started seeing information here and there and everywhere, getting emails, seeing it in the news a little bit, that people are questioning. I remember seeing something about the Pentagon, people saying that maybe a plane did hit the Pentagon. Yeah. And I started looking into it and spent a few weeks researching it deeply, everything that had been produced at that time, and came to the conclusion that all three buildings, the Twin Towers and Building 7 of the World Trade Center complex, were brought down by controlled demolition. And I was deeply moved by that realization. I didn't know that I would end up spending the next 16 years of my life working on that issue, but that's what has happened. I was deeply moved by it, and for me, I could not accept the idea, and I cannot accept the idea that such a fundamental, foundational event in our culture and our society and the way that our society is governed could be false, could be such a fraud, and that everything, our foreign policy and domestic policy, everything that we're doing is ordered around this, this mythical story, really upset me. And so I've spent, my life trying to change that and trying to correct the record of what really happened that day and hopefully, create a different world.
You mentioned the attack on the Pentagon. Now, there are a few dozen cameras around the Pentagon. All that they have released to the public is 2 or 3 slides. What do you think hit the Pentagon?
I have no opinion on it. My opinion is that the videos, there must be dozens of videos. I've heard something like 80 videos, 80 cameras trained at the Pentagon. My opinion is that those videos should be released.
The FBI came by and confiscated all the footage from the 2 or 3 dozen cameras within the hour.
Yes, confiscated videos, video cameras, gas stations confiscated, and obviously the Pentagon itself would have probably dozens of cameras looking at, trained on the building. Not a single member of the public in the United States or in the world has seen a video of what actually happened there. It is the problem. There's a big debate within the 9/11 Truth movement as to whether a plane did hit the Pentagon or not, and I don't have an opinion on that, and I haven't spent a lot of time researching that. One thing I'm very certain of is that Hani Hanjour, one of the alleged hijackers, was not capable of piloting that plane.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, so he basically couldn't fly. He basically did not know how to fly. He could barely fly a small Cessna plane. There's no way that he flew a large airliner in a very complex route, into the side of the Pentagon. Simply impossible, and that's the official story.
Who or what do you think flew that plane, Ted?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that plane hit the Pentagon or not. I think it's most likely that whatever plane was posing as, I believe that it was not the hijacked plane, most likely, and that whatever was flying that plane was probably remote controlled.
2 planes went down, one into the ground, one into the Pentagon, and there's no engines, no nothing. I think we may be being fed a fairy tale. But a passport falls from a tower and ends up on the sidewalk, not even singed.
That's what we call planted evidence.
That's a fairy tale.
Yes, it's fairy tale. Again, with the plane that allegedly crashed in Shanksville, or whatever happened to it, from what I can tell, the plane was probably shot down.
Yep, that's what I heard too.
Whatever is there in that field in Shanksville is just a hole in the ground, and there's not a plane there.
We're meant to accept what's been fed to us, that a plane goes down into the ground and there's nothing there. Ted, let's talk about building number 7. What stands out the most about building number 7 to you?
Well, I think, as we know, most people who look, because we've done surveys on this, most people who watch Building 7 go down believe that it was brought down by controlled demolition.
Yeah.
So it's pretty straightforward that it was. You can just look at the behavior of the building, the way that it comes down symmetrically into its footprint.
The average public, do they believe that story?
The majority of the public does not know that a third building collapsed on 9/11. Still, yeah. We do surveys on it. We do surveys on it every few years, and we find that around 60% of people self-report that they knew a third building came down on 9/11, and maybe 40% say they didn't know. I think that the people that say that they knew probably didn't really know. That's just kind of some of them. That's just their answer to the question. So I think the majority don't actually know that the third building came down. Of the people that do, they have never seen it. They can't name the building. We find that only 1 out of 7 people can name Building 7, right? That's the level of knowledge that we're talking about.
This is a good time to give out the website for your organization, where you can actually see the footage of building number 7 coming down in its footprint.
If you go to AE911Truth.org, on our homepage, you can see the destruction of Building 7, and you can see the destruction of the towers right there. In the case of the towers, just to jump to that, the footage that we have on our homepage, you can look at it and see that the building is exploding. We show it over and over in a loop and analyze it. The building is exploding. You are not watching a building collapse. You're watching a building completely disintegrate, and all of the contents of the building is being pulverized, and the steel structures being shattered and ejected hundreds of feet in all directions.
What about foreknowledge? BBC, news media? How do you explain that they were told, move back, the building is going to blow up?
Yeah, so at around 11:30 in the morning, so the second tower went down at 10:30, about 10:28. And so within an hour, officials at the scene started warning that Building 7 was going to collapse.
Wow.
That's a full 6 hours before it actually did. And they said, oh, there's some damage to the building. Oh, there's some fires. We're concerned that this building is going to come down. But they weren't just concerned; they were pretty much certain of it. If you read the oral histories of the fire department in New York, all the personnel who gave testimony after 9/11, you see that most of them and the chiefs are saying the building is going to come down. There's a lot of certainty. That certainty eventually, foreknowledge filtered to the news media, and the people who are on the scene at MSNBC and BBC and so on were reporting this building, that is the building that's going to go down next. The BBC reported it as having happened.
The poor reporter from BBC, it's right behind her shoulder, just gone down, oh well, it's coming down soon. It's like slapstick.
Yeah. This is an event, this is something that doesn't happen. Like steel frame buildings don't just collapse because of fires.
In the history of steel frame buildings, they've never come down like this before.
In the history of steel frame buildings, no steel frame building has ever come down due to fire. Now there are 2 buildings that have collapsed after 9/11, which we'd be going down a bit of a rabbit hole. One of them collapsed it was in Tehran in January of 2017. Okay. We studied the collapse of that building within the days and weeks after it happened. And we determined that it was most likely demolished as well. And so you can actually find that on our website if you go to AE911Truth.org/Plasco. Our preliminary hypothesis a month after that collapse was that it was actually a controlled demolition, and that is our position, is that building was demolished.
You're listening to Ted Walter on Perspectives with Barry Shainbaum in Toronto. We're lucky to have him here today. So many abnormalities happened that day, and we are not using our ability to question. And the news media on 9/11 only have on their shows family members who follow the party line. You have people like Bob McElvenney and others. Does the media want to talk to him besides me and a few others?
Not enough. Bob has done a few interviews with mainstream media over the years.
That's good. Good he hasn't.
He was invited on to Geraldo Rivera's show in 2010. Geraldo Rivera saw a TV ad with Bob and other family members educating the public about the collapse of Building 7. So here and there have been opportunities, but by and large there haven't been, and that's really, really sad. The media, sadly, but not surprisingly, I've come to learn, has been complicit. Was complicit in promulgating the false story of what happened on 9/11.
I am so frustrated that we allowed the authorities to tarnish thought leaders and call them conspiracy theorists, when often it's the government that puts out the conspiracy theory. What do you think?
I'm frustrated as well, Barry.
Yeah.
It's deeply frustrating. When I read newspaper articles and I see that term used, and I see it used seriously by people who call themselves journalists, like I can't believe that the term is like actually in a way allowed to be used.
Yeah.
It's such a obvious pejorative, such a epithet. I believe it's someday that term will not like be an acceptable term to use like in civil discourse. Like I think it'll go out of fashion like other words that we don't use anymore because they're not respectful. So to me it's an embarrassment when a journalist like uses that term. They're telling you that they're, in a way, that they're not a serious journalist, that they're a propagandist, that they're not really interested in getting to the facts of an issue, and they're just ultimately trying to tarnish somebody without actually looking at the facts and looking at the evidence.
Now, I understand that the CIA actually chose that phrase to do the most damage and ridicule. Did you hear the same?
That's my understanding. I mean, the term existed before then, but in I believe it was 1967, as skepticism surrounding the assassination of JFK was growing, they issued that memo to CIA stations all over the world, directing them how to use that term to discredit critics of the Warren Commission. And I think that really it took off. We know that there are a lot of assets and agents and so on in the news media. There was at that time, and there probably continues to be. Mm-hmm. And the use of that term, proliferated. It was used more and more. And today is, I don't know. I don't know if anybody's measured it recently, but obviously we see it in the news constantly. It is very much CIA, not a CIA creation, but I think the CIA was responsible for proliferating the use of that term.
What's the name of that operation Kennedy would not sign off on, the false flag?
Operation Northwoods.
What year was Operation Northwoods? Do you remember?
I think it was in the early 60s, 1961, 1962, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the U.S. military developed the Operation Northwoods plan.
What was in that plan?
Oh, I don't know the details, but it involved, shooting down aircraft and killing U.S. civilians and blaming it on Cuba and using that as a pretext to invade Cuba.
If that would have made the news, people would have said, bad, bad Cuba, bring it forward to 9/11. Planes going into buildings, that's supposed to be a conspiracy. Americans killing Americans. Would have been a tragedy. If more people knew about Operation Northwoods, more people would understand that these things are being done. What is a democracy if we don't ask questions? Tell me about the Jersey Widows.
Yeah, so the Jersey Widows, sometimes called the Jersey Girls, were a group of women who lost their husbands on 9/11 and who, in the year after 9/11, campaigned for an investigation to happen because there wasn't a real investigation taking place. The Senate was having a limited inquiry to the whole thing and to the intelligence failures, they called it, but there was no real investigation, and the Bush administration was resisting having an investigation. So eventually they gathered enough political momentum and enough support from members of Congress, and they got the 9/11 Commission to be formed. They then oversaw the work. I want to say I don't mean oversaw that they had any power of it, but they monitored the work of the 9/11 Commission from 2002 to 2004. And when the 9/11 Commission report came out, along the way they had many criticisms of how it was being run. The fact that a pretty much de facto member of the Bush administration was made the executive director of the 9/11 Commission. His name was Philip Zelikow.
Before that was Henry Kissinger, right?
They first tried to appoint Henry Kissinger, and there was a huge uproar from the Jersey Girls and the other 9/11 families. And so instead they appointed Philip Zelikow, who was a member of the Bush administration transition team as the Bush administration was taking office. He had authored a book with Condoleezza Rice, who was George W. Bush's national security advisor. This was the man who was in charge of the 9/11 Commission. Yes. So the Jersey Girls protested that, but didn't get their way for him to step down. And then in 2004, the 9/11 Commission report was released, and the Jersey Girls and many other 9/11 families essentially, opposed. I don't want to say opposed, but were deeply critical of the 9/11 Commission report and its narrative. They had a list of 400 questions that they wanted the 9/11 Commission to address, and something like only 100 of those questions were addressed. 300 of them were not. Really basic questions about how are the attacks financed. So the Jersey Girls are sort of, a lot of people say that the Jersey Girls were the birth of the 9/11 Truth movement to some extent. Of course, there were other people out there that were questioning things, that were asking the right questions as well in that first year or two after 9/11. But in many ways, you could say the spiritual birth of the 9/11 Truth movement was the Jersey girls and the other 9/11 families that worked with them.
Ted Walter, are you aware of what the Jersey Widows are up to today?
I believe that they have dedicated their time, and I think that they've pulled back to some extent because it's exhausting and it's been over 20 years.
Yeah.
I'm speculating here, going on little things that I've heard here and there in emails with them over the past few years. So this may not be current,
Okay.
but recently they've been dedicating their time to the Saudi case. The 9/11 families,
Okay.
many of them are plaintiffs in a case against Saudi Arabia.
They're suing them. They're trying to sue them.
Trying to sue Saudi Arabia for their involvement in the attacks and in assisting some of the alleged hijackers. So I don't know where that case is right now. It's always kind of ongoing, and I don't know exactly how involved the Jersey girls are at this moment. But I know that they still seem to be somewhat active.
Let's go back to that day in 2001. Within a few hours, they said that bin Laden had been the perpetrator of the attacks, and all planes except for 2 were shot down across North America. The 2 were the 2 planes that picked up bin Laden relatives to get them out of the country when everyone else was grounded. Why wouldn't they keep them and question them?
That's a really good question, Barry, and it doesn't make any sense. There's a lot of good evidence that Osama bin Laden, the narrative is that, when the war in Afghanistan ended, as many people know, but not everybody knows, bin Laden was an ally of the United States, during the war in Afghanistan.
The Mujahideen, right?
The Mujahideen, which the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, funded and operated to fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Did the CIA?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And the CIA was involved in that whole operation. After the war in Afghanistan ended, the narrative is that at some point bin Laden and the United States split, and bin Laden turned against the United States. So, this is not an area that I'm an expert in, but something about Saudi Arabia having troops, U.S. having troops in Saudi Arabia, blah, blah, blah. Bin Laden was suddenly, enemy number one.
A convenient target, perhaps.
A convenient target, because Al-Qaeda did go on, what is called Al-Qaeda, did go on to be involved in other wars outside of Afghanistan in the 90s, in the Balkans, and in other countries in that region of the world, in Central Asia and Northern Africa. All along, there's pretty good evidence that Osama bin Laden actually remained an ally of the United States. There's credible reports, I believe in a French newspaper in the summer of 2001, that he was in a military hospital in somewhere in the Middle East.
The reports have it that on September the 10th, he was visited by a physician in Pakistan and got dialysis because of his diabetes. Was there any proof that he killed anybody with regards to 9/11?
There's no proof. The United States has never actually produced any evidence that bin Laden was involved in the 9/11 attacks. He denied it. It is widely acknowledged that the video where Osama bin Laden is allegedly saying that he perpetrated the 9/11 attacks was not bin Laden.
Yeah.
It was bin Laden lookalike. The FBI has said, when asked why is bin Laden not wanted for the attacks of 9/11, is that there's no evidence to try him. Colin Powell said that they were going to produce evidence before they invaded Iraq, and then they didn't.
What about when the towers came down? World Trade Center 1 and 2. Isn't that a crime scene? Was it treated like a crime scene?
No, it was not. The city of New York moved very quickly to begin hauling away and destroying all of the evidence at ground zero.
What reason do you think?
It's really not my place to speculate, but I think the effect of them doing that was that it was impossible to carry out a real investigation into how investigations are normally conducted when there are building collapses or other types of major disasters. You preserve the evidence and you study it carefully. That didn't take place. So the purported investigations that ended up happening into how these buildings came down were basically based on computer models, and their stories are totally speculative, and there's no evidence actually supporting them.
There must have been a lot of people involved in this right from day one. By day 2, they were taking away scrap metal.
Sure, there's a lot of contractors down there. And there are people that we've interviewed, people that were involved in the cleanup, who say that that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolition, who realized it when they were down there, or who came to that realization later on. So a lot of people were involved, but it was Mayor Giuliani, Rudolph Giuliani, and the Department of Design and Construction that oversaw what happened there.
Giuliani was portrayed as a hero. How long did it take to come out that he was a bit suspicious on what happened that day?
Oh, well, I would say some people were probably asking questions right away, but I think the destruction of the evidence that we've been speaking of was a big red flag for a lot of people. Why is the city of New York just hauling away all this steel? By late September 2001, the people who were dispatched to investigate the collapse of the buildings by the American Society of Civil Engineers and FEMA told the city of New York that they wanted them to stop destroying the steel. The 9/11 families began protesting and telling the city of New York, stop destroying the steel. You know, we want a proper investigation into how these buildings came down. And despite that, the city of New York continued to destroy the steel, to have it, you know, to sell it off and have it recycled. And for no reason. The best reason they could come up with was, well, this is what we decided to do and we've already been doing it, so we're just going to keep doing it. Even though, you know, many people were saying, you know, stop destroying the steel.
Ted Walter joins us in studio in Toronto. The media. What would you say is the main reason that nobody says a word about 9/11? No one questions anything. What happened to democracy?
Well, a lot of people do question what happened. You know, a lot of people do question the official story, upwards of 20%, maybe even more, in the United States. And I think we know higher percentages in other countries throughout the world. The problem is that this significant number of people doesn't have any sort of political representation, have little access to fair coverage in the media, and so on. And so it's a huge problem, and I'm not necessarily the best person to describe it, but we know that, you know, challenging the official narrative of the US government of what happened in an event like 9/11 is going to be an uphill battle. The mainstream media in the United States and in other countries is sadly not going to really investigate what happened and is going to work to support the official narrative.
This is Perspectives with Barry Shainbaum. The attacks on 9/11 opened up the door to bombing Afghanistan 3 weeks later, and also going into Iraq. Upwards of 1 million people have died as a result of what happened on 9/11. If 15 of the 19 hijackers had Saudi passports, why were they going into Afghanistan?
Well, there was a claim made that Afghanistan was hosting Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And, you know, the United States made this sort of unilateral declaration that anybody who harbors terrorists, anybody who harbors Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, will also pay the price. Of course, we know that the United States have been working for years to get access to build a pipeline from Central Asia, from the Caspian Basin, to ship natural gas from Central Asia to the Indian Ocean. And they needed to build a pipeline through Afghanistan, and the Taliban was sort of standing in their way of doing that. Many people think that that is the reason why, the main reason why the US government, why the Bush administration wanted to remove the Taliban.
Can you comment on reports that prior to the 9/11 attacks, the Taliban were invited to Washington for a meeting, and in this meeting, the US government promised the Taliban there would be weapons used against them?
I know exactly what you're talking about, yeah. I don't know that I have anything to add to it. I can corroborate that that is my understanding.
What some people have said is the location of the attacks on Afghanistan went along completely with the location of where this oil pipeline was going. So there's a strategy to the whole thing. Put you on the spot, Ted. What's your definition of the word justice?
Fairness, equity, that all human beings have a right to dignity and to be treated with respect and to be given opportunity to succeed and survive and flourish in their lives.
A phrase popped into my ear with liberty and justice for all. What's that from?
I believe that's the end of the Pledge of Allegiance.
Even in the Holocaust, Albert Eichmann had a trial. Bin Laden never had a trial. How can you say justice was served when there's no attempt to have a trial?
Well, I agree. I think what they did, what they very cleverly did, which was their plan, was to call what happened an act of war and not a crime. And if it were a crime, then you hopefully identify the perpetrators and bring them to justice. And very quickly, people in the US government and the Bush administration and neoconservatives, writing in the media and the Washington Post began talking about this as an act of war. And in war, justice kind of goes away, right? And instead of a courtroom, we're going to have military tribunals where we're going to try alleged terrorists. And instead of a proper legal process, we're going to, without any evidence provided to the global public, the global community, we're going to wage a war against this country for harboring this group of people that allegedly perpetrated these attacks. So that's what happened. Yeah, and that's not justice. That is not the closing words of the Pledge of Allegiance.
Ted Walter, do you believe that the state of democracy in the United States has been harmed by 9/11?
I think the state of democracy in the United States has been profoundly harmed by the events of 9/11. You know, you look at the laws that were passed after 9/11, the Patriot Act, you know, surveillance, lack of privacy, and in a bigger, you know, the amount of the trillions of dollars that have been spent on war over the last 20 years, trillions of dollars that could be put towards other needs and other purposes. You know, that is the undermining of democracy. I'm not saying that it was a perfect or even well-functioning democracy if it was a democracy at all before 9/11, but 9/11 only worsened the state of democracy in the U.S.
Ted Walter joins us in Toronto. Now, after these acts, like the Patriot Act, have been put in there to safeguard the United States, they have a sunset clause that eventually they vote to continue. Are you aware of the Utah Data Center?
The Utah Data Center?
Yeah.
That is probably where they store all the communications of Americans.
The Utah Data Center stores every bit of communication worldwide. They needed a special exemption for that state because of the water that it takes to cool all those computers. What about the safeguards of citizens around the world? It's all gone after 9/11. There is no more privacy in the world.
I assume that every call that I make is listened to, sadly. It is sad and scary. One of writing that I've been interested in recently, Graham McQueen has written about this. It's from Vince Alandria, who studied the JFK assassination. And at a certain point, he said, let's throw out all these details that we've been fighting over and arguing about, and that, you know, he asked the question, what would an honest government do?
Right.
Right? If an honest government that actually represented the interests of its people, how would they behave in this situation? How would they investigate this event, this crime? And when you look at how NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, investigated the destruction of the Twin Towers in Building 7, we can see that NIST did not act in the way that an honest government would do. NIST did not actually look at the hundreds of eyewitness accounts of explosions in the towers. NIST came up with a story that is completely infeasible, physically infeasible, according to the thousands of engineers that we represent.
Right.
So if NIST is a federal agency, an agency of the U.S. government, and they're not doing what does that tell you? What we know from looking at how NIST did its investigation, the U.S. government covered up the demolition of 3 buildings. It covered up the real cause of the murder of nearly 3,000 people. So why would the U.S. government do that?
Ted Walter, you were on my show twice with an initiative to get the city of New York to do what?
Ultimately, the goal was to get the city of New York to conduct an investigation into the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7, which was the 3rd tower that came down on 9/11, which most people don't know happened.
Did it get enough votes?
It didn't get on the ballot
Okay.
because ballot initiatives are not very common in New York City and in New York State in general, local ballot initiatives. It's hard to get an initiative on the ballot. We got enough signatures,
Right.
but there's a labyrinth of laws that your proposition, your question has to comply with in order to be legally valid. And so you have to make sure that it's like bulletproof perfect. And the city of New York argued on a few different grounds that there were issues with our initiative in ways that it didn't comply with all the laws of New York State.
Do you wonder why the city fought so vociferously against it? Or is it their job to oppose?
It's their job to oppose it. I think that there was an additional impetus to make sure that it didn't get on the ballot, to make sure that, you know, the city of New York would not conduct an investigation into the collapse of that building. But it is the reflexive position of the city of New York, of the law department of the city of New York, to challenge pretty much anything that the voters try to put on the ballot.
What about the second time you were on my show? What was it?
Similar strategy was to try to get an initiative on the ballot in New York City in 2009. The second one I was involved in drafting. The first one, I came on board and helped with the petition drive. It was an initiative that was drafted by Dr. William Pepper. And the idea was to create a full-scale 9/11 commission, but a local 9/11 commission based in New York City to reinvestigate, you know, all of the attacks.
Were you involved in the Building What campaign?
I was involved in the Building What campaign. Yeah, that was sort of an ad campaign and a public awareness campaign to raise awareness of Building 7.
There was a judge. He got confused. He said, building what? Brilliant name.
Yeah, so that was, his name was Judge Lehner, and that was when, in 2009, when we were trying to get that first initiative on the ballot, we were talking about Building 7 in the courtroom, and the judge who's a New York judge said, building what? Didn't know what Building 7 was. So that was subsequently, yes, as you said, that was the name of that campaign that followed.
Why do you think building number 7 was demolished, if it was?
That's a good question, and it's a question that would be better handled by real investigators and journalists. We at Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth look at the science of how the building came down, and we show that it was certainly a controlled demolition. Some people have suggested that Building 7, it housed many federal agencies like the Secret Service, the FBI, the CIA, all had offices there.
Rudy Giuliani's Operations Center.
The Emergency Operations Center for the Office of Emergency Management of New York City was also located in that building on the 23rd floor. And many people suspect that was sort of where the event 9/11 was largely planned, or at least one aspect of it, the destruction of the towers. And so bringing down that building was sort of getting rid of the evidence, let's say. There was also the Securities and Exchange Commission on one floor in Building 7 was investigating the Enron and WorldCom scandals. Wow. And many of the documents that were involved in those investigations were completely destroyed and could not be replaced when the building went down. So people have speculated that additional motive. Some people have, and I don't know the truthfulness of these reports, but some people have said that there was like gold in the bottom of Building 7. And so there was another, for the people that really were on the front line of planning this, did it so that they can go in and grab some gold.
I heard that.
I don't know. I don't know. I would like to see a real investigation take place so that we can find out.
On September the 10th, there was an investigation looking into the loss of $2.4 trillion. And the very next day, September the 11th, the building came down, all the papers were gone, and the investigation stopped in its tracks. I'm Jewish. There are some people who use 9/11 to fuel anti-Semitism and also hurt Israel. Have you heard these stories that Israeli employees did not go to work that day? Are those stories made up to hurt Jews? Who did stay home that day, if anybody?
I am not knowledgeable about that. I tend to think that those stories are kind of concocted, the idea of just hundreds and hundreds of Jewish people or Israelis not going to work that day.
Yeah.
One Jewish person I think Zionist who did not go into work that day was Larry Silverstein.
Right, yeah.
The owner of Building 7 and the leaseholder of the Twin Towers. He had a dermatology appointment, we're told. But every other day, he went into the windows in the world on the top of the North Tower to have breakfast, and that day he did not. And
he fought like hell to have both buildings looked at as two separate incidents. Business is business. Money is money.
Yeah, he argued it was two separate events and collected more than he would if it was just one event.
Ted Walter, do you see any possibility of momentum towards more surveillance, less ability to speak freely, changing, or will it become even worse down the road when someone just wants to speak their mind and ask questions?
I don't know. I think that there is definitely a more of a sense of pressure, social pressure, political pressure, and not to question official narratives about important events. I think that there's a complete erosion of privacy when it comes to being able to talk about these things, being able to be a political dissident in general. Is it going to change? I think that it will require tremendous progress on raising awareness among the general public of these issues that we're talking about, and 9/11 in particular. And I believe that it's possible, or I wouldn't still be doing this work. I'm hopeful that the trend that we're seeing right now will reverse, but I don't know if it's going to happen.
If your organization found a smoking gun, proof Americans were part of it or didn't stop it, what would you do with it? How would you bring it up to the world? God knows what would happen.
I have thought about it. We would have to be very strategic about how we release that information.
Yeah.
And I don't want to talk about what strategies would be employed, but we would do our very best to get that information out in a way that it would sort of self-replicate and be impossible to suppress.
what would happen to the makeup of society if it did come out that the U.S. was somehow involved with it or let it happen. It would definitely be a major shakeup.
Well, I think we're due for a shakeup. I think we're due for some big shakeups. And I think that the period might initially be traumatic and challenging, but I think not even the long run, I think rather quickly, I think we would figure it out as a society. And I think we would evolve and become a much smarter, more civilized, more humane society once we understand what 9/11 was. And we would, as a society, dedicate ourselves to making sure that something like that could never happen again. And we would, I believe, move towards things like the abolition of war.
I heard somewhere, probably a previous guest, that when proof comes out, the only way to move forward is to grant clemency to every person with blood on their hands.
It's an interesting idea. I can't predict what would make it easier to move forward in a positive way. I think we really would be in uncharted territory as a society.
Uncharted, whoa, yeah.
And
Uncharted.
I believe that those people should face justice, and clemency may not fit the bill. I personally don't believe in the death penalty, so I would argue against death penalty for any of these people. I think that society has to feel that those people were brought to justice, to move on. So I would wager that how those people are treated, and the idea that if we treat them better, if we just, clemency, as you say, that would be instrumental to moving on, evolving in a positive direction. It's an interesting idea. Maybe it's right. At this point, I don't believe it. I'm not persuaded by it, but maybe.
Ted Walter, as we come towards the end of the interview, I need to ask you, the events of 9/11, do you see them as a one-off or as part of a series of events?
I think it's part of a series of things. And I think other similar things, may well happen in the future.
How do you see the U.S. moving forward with regards to the 9/11 attacks?
There's no way to move forward until we have the truth of what actually happened that day. We will continue to be on a destructive path. Without truth, nothing that we do related to 9/11 can be good. Truth is the key to healing and to creating a better society. And that is why millions of people still fight for the truth to be revealed.
How do we inspire the news media to do their job?
Well, I think we have to I think everybody who cares about this issue just has to keep doing what they're doing and continue to think creatively and not give up hope. There's not one solution that is going to get somebody in the media or the media at large to cover this issue in the right way. It is just all of us continuing to dedicate ourselves, and the more people that are doing things to educate others, the good things will start to happen. We need some luck. Luck is a part of this. We need some good luck.
Yeah.
We need good things to happen, but luck, good luck won't happen and render positive results if we don't all continue to fight and to talk about this issue and to not give up. I have a lot of hope for the family of Jeff Campbell, who died on 9/11, his brother Matt, and the rest of his family.
Are they in England? Or?
They're in England, and right now they are trying to open a new inquest into his death. And English law is very supportive of families that want new inquests if they believe that there's new evidence that contradicts the original findings, which we have thousands of pages of evidence that contradict the finding from Jeff Campbell's first inquest, which says that he died because the North Tower collapsed due to the airplane hitting it. And so I'm very hopeful that this family within the next couple of years will be able to have a new inquest into Jeff's death, and that can be something that is sort of a catalyst, not by itself, but that can be a big piece. And then the media, if they're granted a new inquest, the media will have to start listening to them. The media in the UK, I think, will start to pay attention. May try to discredit them somehow.
Right.
But let's see. I'd love to see the media try to discredit this family that is trying to get the truth about how their son died.
Ted, tell us about Spike Lee and Richard Gage. What happened?
Sure. So last year, around the 20th anniversary of 9/11, Spike Lee released an 8-part 8-hour docuseries on HBO where he covered COVID-19 and 9/11 from the perspective of New York City. And in the final half hour of this 8-hour series, he was going to look at the destruction of the Twin Towers in Building 7, and he interviewed upwards of a dozen people affiliated with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, both architects, engineers, and 9/11 family members, first responders. And that was going to air on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And once the media got a hold of the screeners and started watching it and reviewing it, there was an uproar because of this half an hour. There was a huge backlash. And unfortunately, the media caught on as well to some comments that our former CEO and founder had made about other issues, in particular COVID-19. And the media really used that as ammo to delegitimize what Spike Lee was trying to do and put pressure on him and on HBO to remove the half an hour from this documentary series, which is what ended up happening within a few days of when all this news broke. And incredibly, it was sort of celebrated in the media, in the New York Times and other media outlets in the US as a great thing that Spike Lee, literally one of the headlines was "Spike Lee did the right thing." Of course, he didn't have a decision in it. He was forced by HBO and Time Warner to remove the half an hour. Shocking that that any artist or any filmmaker could be pressured into censoring their artwork. But Spike Lee, a very celebrated filmmaker, on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, being pressured and forced to remove content from his documentary is a blight and shocking. And the fact that the media would celebrate it tells you that the media has no interest in real journalistic standards and in truth and all the things that we care about, that we cherish.
If they're not hiding anything, why wouldn't they allow people to speak? I think the American people are ignoring a terrible transgression.
It is alarming, and I wouldn't blame the American people. Not that you necessarily mean to, but I think the problem is the media, and the media not treating that as shocking, and framing it as if that's reasonable. I could see why they wouldn't want to be under oath and be alone when they're because of course there's some sensitive stuff about what happened on 9/11, and they want to avoid maybe the media spins that as they're trying to avoid this idea that they were somehow incompetent or negligent. But whatever it may be that they're hiding, that there was an uproar, starting with the media itself, is a problem.
Ted, you used the word incompetent. It reminds me of what Ed Asner said in his tribute. He said what's shocking to him is that nobody was even demoted, not even for incompetence.
All of the vaunted defense systems of this greatest power that ever existed could not prevent one act. Since that infamous day, not one person has ever been punished for laxness, for inefficiency, for anything. And I think that's shocking and shameful. It scares the hell out of me that the people, sometimes referred to as the American sheeple, can so blithely go on with their lives and not challenge Big Brother.
Well, I think that if it were a real attack and there had been a real failure on somebody's part, there would have been punishment. Yeah. But it wasn't a real terrorist attack by outsiders.
Thank you, Ted. Building number 7 was not hit by a plane. What's the official story as to why it came down?
Oh yeah, it's a far-fetched, fantastical story about how fires heated this one beam and it expanded and pushed this other beam or girder off of its connection to a column, and then there was a cascade of floor failures. And it's sort of Rube Goldberg? He was like a cartoonist who made these drawings, these cartoons of how these elaborate scenarios of how this thing happens and that leads to this and that leads to that and then this falls and then this ball rolls down the thing and then da-da-da-da. So that's basically the official story of Building 7's collapse, is a series of very impossible events we've shown are impossible, and then some culminates of one column failing and then Suddenly, all the rest of the columns fail, but you can't see any of this happening inside the building. All these columns are failing, but the building looks completely motionless. And then suddenly it just starts to drop in free fall.
Are we being sold a fantasy?
Yes, we are being sold a fantasy.
Ted Walker, Director of Strategy for 911 Truth. Thank you for coming into the studio today in downtown Toronto.
Thank you, Barry. It's great to see you.
You too. Please give us contact information for AE911, that's Architects and Engineers for 911 Truth.
Yeah, so people can go to AE911truth.org, and there's an array of information there and ways to get involved.
Thanks for listening to Perspectives with Barry Shainbaum. You can subscribe on Spotify and on YouTube for more perspectives.